Welcome back to 3 months of Modal Logics, a sequel to the 100 Days of Logic here with Carneades.org. Today we are going to be finishing up our month of Deontic logic with common sense Deontic logic. So this is going to be a bit of a complicated video. We're kind of trying to do something, build on top of the Deontic logic we've already built. If you haven't followed all of the other Deontic logic videos, you may still be able to understand this if you followed some of the first ones. It's going to be a little complicated, but it's not necessarily going to build on all of the semantics and the systems we were recently looking at. So, let's go. It seems that the current set of predicates that we possess to represent our Deontic propositions is insufficient. We just have obligatory, impermissible, permissible, omissible, and optional right now. And it seems that there's a deeper level of expression that we can do with predicates about things that are good and bad. So imagine you hear from an acquaintance that they need a kidney transplant. You have several options of what you could do. You could offer your sincere condolences, you could offer to help them find a donor, or you could offer to donate your kidney. The point is that while all of these three things may seem to fall into kind of the optional category of things you can do, it seems that they're very importantly and very morally speaking different things that you can do. So, while we would not consider any one of these obligatory, we might consider at least one of them obligatory. You at least have to either offer your condolences, offer to help find a donor, offer to donate your kidney. But this does not seem to really fully explain the situation, even by doing that, because it seems that we might describe C as the least we could do, and D as the most we could do. In this video, we're going to offer some new predicates to represent these new distinctions, which expand on what is meant by an action being optional. We're only going to focus down on optional actions and see what we can say about those optional actions to give some more distinction, give some more fine grain to how we're expressing these different ideas. So, first off, the first predicate we're going to add is the maximal predicate, which is represented by MA. MAP means P is included in the most you can do. The important thing here is that we're not saying that P is all of the most you can do. We're saying that P is included in the maximal course of action. P is included in the list of things that would be important for you doing the most that you can do. It's not all of that, but it's part of that. It's one member of the set of things that you must do to take the maximal course of action. So, MA, you get tested to see if your kidneys are a match, would mean that getting tested to see if your kidneys are a match is part of the most that you can do. It's not all of the most that you can do, clearly, but it's part of that process. We're also going to have another predicate known as minimal, and we're going to represent that with MI. Minimal, in contrast, is going to mean that an action is included in the least you can do. So MIP is going to be P is included in the least you can do. MI, saying you're very sorry to hear that, would mean that saying you're sorry to hear that is part of the least that you could do. It's interesting to note that something could be both part of the maximal course of action and the minimal course of action. If, for example, there was only one course of action. Or because it seems that saying you're very sorry to hear that is part of the minimal course of action, but it might also be part of the maximal course of action as well. We might say that even if you're going to offer to donate your kidney, you should probably also say that you're very sorry to hear that. But you would see that, for example, you get tested to see if your kidneys are a match would probably not be part of the minimal course of action. We're going to look at a couple more examples for this. So if you didn't fully understand everything that's going on here, don't worry. We're going to talk about it some more. So, we're also going to introduce a couple more predicates beyond the call, which we're going to represent with BC. BCP is going to mean that P is included in going beyond the call of duty. It's basically not included in the minimal root. It's optional, but it's not included in the minimal root. It's somehow beyond the minimal root, above the call of duty, beyond what you have to do, beyond the absolute minimum. So BC, offering to provide help with the situation, would mean that offering to provide help is going to be going beyond the call of duty, doing more than the least you can do. That can be contrasted with permissibly suboptimal. So permissibly suboptimal means that P is included in the course of action that is permissible but not maximal. So just that BC is not minimal, PS is going to be not maximal. It's permissible, but it's less than the best. It's less than the optimal situation. So PS, not offering to be tested to see if you could donate, would mean that not offering to see if you could donate would be permissible. It's allowed, but it's suboptimal. It's less than the most you could do. Note that something can both be beyond the call and permissibly suboptimal as well. For example, if there were a minimal root, a maximal root, and a root kind of in the middle between those. It's not the most you can do, but it's not the least you can do. That root, the things that require you to do that root, or that are required such that you do that root, would be both beyond the call and permissibly suboptimal. Hopefully that makes sense. Once again, we're going to go through at least one example to make sense of this. We're also going to add two final predicates. The first one is indifferent, which we're going to represent with IN. INP means that it's indifferent, that P. There's not a moral obligation one way or another. Once again, this is still included in the optional category because it means that it's not obligatory and it's not impermissible, but it's importantly different than propositions that are optional but morally significant. So IN, you tie your shoe during the conversation, means that it's morally indifferent that you do or do not tie your shoe during the conversation. Indifferent is going to be contrasted with significant, which we're going to represent with SI. SI means that it's morally significant, that P. SI, offering to help the person, would mean it is morally significant whether or not you help the person. The point here is that these two are going to be contradictory in some way. So if something is morally significant, it can't be indifferent. If something is indifferent, it can't be morally significant. Okay? These 6 terms can be defined in terms of 3 of them and the terms that we already have. So we can define beyond the call as an action is permissible and it is explicitly not part of the minimal course of action. An action is going to be permissibly suboptimal if and only if it's permissible and explicitly not part of the maximally permissible course of action. And by definition, something is significant if and only if it's not indifferent. Okay? Hopefully that helps you understand how we can define beyond the call, permissibly suboptimal, and significant in terms of permissible, maximal, minimal, and indifferent. Hopefully that makes sense. Now, in order to think about this, we're going to envision a big old Venn diagram. We have our good old-fashioned predicates of permissible on one side and omissible on the other side. So everything in the first circle is permissible. Everything in the second circle is omissible. Things that are in only that first circle and not the second circle are going to be obligatory. And things that are only in that second circle and not shared between them are going to be impermissible. And of course, in the center, we're going to have things that are optional. What we have to remember is all of these new distinctions don't fall into any other category other than optional. So we're going to imagine our diagram zooming down into optional. So this circle is just representing all of the optional propositions. Now, we're going to have some kind of concentric circles here. So inside the center circle, we have propositions that are both optional and significant. And outside that circle, we have propositions that are optional and indifferent. It's important to note that this is not the only place where one can find morally significant propositions. In fact, propositions that are obligatory or propositions that are impermissible are also going to be morally significant. This is, however, the only place we're going to find indifferent propositions. So it's important that we separate these. Basically, what we're looking at right now is the propositions that are morally significant and are optional. So once again, we're going to zoom in further past our indifferent to just the circle that holds our significant propositions. And we're going to divide this into not one, not two, but 9 different areas. We're going to do this with a kind of quadruple Venn diagram here. Once again, we're only looking at propositions that are significant and optional. Within this, now we can use our new maximal, minimal, beyond the call, permissibly suboptimal predicates. So let's see. We're going to take this bottom circle as maximal. So anything that's in that bottom circle is going to be an action that is explicitly included in the maximal course of action, which means that PS, not P, is the case because of the relationship between maximal and permissibly suboptimal. On the top circle, everything in that top circle is going to be actions that are explicitly excluded from the maximal course of action, or actions that are permissibly suboptimal. Okay, that's everything in that top circle. Everything in the circle on the right is going to be things that are explicitly included in the minimal course of action. So anything in that circle on the right is going to be something that's explicitly included in the minimal course of action, which means that BC, not P, basically. And on the other side, on the left, we're going to have actions that are explicitly excluded from the minimal course of action, which are going to be actions that are beyond the call. All right? Now that you have a little bit of the general landscape, let's look at what each of these specific 9 different areas looks like. So, first we have this area down here, which is the area that is in the maximal course of action, but neither explicitly included in or excluded from the minimal course of action. So actions that are part of the maximal course of action, but aren't necessarily part of the minimal course or not part of the minimal course of action. On the top, we're going to kind of get the opposite situation. These are actions that are excluded from the maximal course of action, but neither explicitly included in or excluded from the minimal course of action. Note how those are kind of similar. Both these areas are areas that include propositions that are not explicitly included or excluded from the minimal course of action. There's going to be one more area like this, but we'll save it for the end. So we now have in the circle on the right, and only in that circle, so not in any of the crossover areas. None of these kind of blue things we're looking at are in the crossover areas. They're just in that circle, just like obligatory didn't include optional in the previous diagram. So over here on the right, we have actions in the minimal course of action, but neither explicitly included in or excluded from the maximal course of action. And over on the left, we're going to have actions that are excluded from the minimal course of action, but neither explicitly included in or excluded from the maximal course of action. So all these areas in blue are explicitly included or excluded from one course of action, but indifferent as to the other course of action. They're not explicitly included or excluded in the other course of action. All right? Those are the areas that don't cross over between the circles. Now we're going to look at the areas that do. So over here in the top right, we have actions in the minimal course of action, but not in the maximal course of action, that are explicitly excluded from the maximal course of action and explicitly included in the minimal course of action. Over in the top left, we have actions that are explicitly excluded from both the maximal and the minimal course of action. All right? But just because they're explicitly excluded from the maximal and the minimal course of action doesn't mean that those are not within our whole sphere of significant optional propositions, because you might have a third kind of middle ground course of action that is excluded from both the maximal and the minimal course of action, but is still permissible, and in fact both beyond the call and permissibly suboptimal. Over here in the bottom right, we have the opposite. We have actions in both the maximal and the minimal course of action. Once again, if there's only one path to take, then all of the actions are going to be in both the maximal and the minimal course of action. And over here in the bottom left, we have actions in the maximal, explicitly included in the maximal, but explicitly excluded from the minimal course of action. Okay? So far we've done 8 different areas. We have the 4 in blue and the 4 in green. All those in green are things that are explicitly referenced in both the maximal and the minimal course of action, either to include them or exclude them. Now, there is a 9th area, and I mentioned it at the beginning, which is an area that is indifferent to not just the one of the maximal or the minimal course of action, but indifferent to both. And that's outside this kind of clover set of Venn diagrams, but still within the significant propositions and the optional propositions. So this is going to be morally significant actions not explicitly included in or excluded from the minimal or maximal course of action. There's a lot of information, there's a lot of words, there's a lot of colors on the screen. So what we're going to do is we're going to give a very specific example to hopefully explain and clear up these ideas. So that was extremely complicated. Now we're going to take a look at an example that will hopefully clarify exactly what these 9 optional and morally significant categories represent. Return to our example. You're speaking to John at a party. He tells you that he needs a kidney transplant. Here are the maximal and minimal courses of action. So the minimal course of action includes I1, hear what John has to say. I2, offer your condolences. I3, say that you are sorry, there's nothing you can do. It explicitly excludes these. It says, do not offer to pay for the operation. Do not offer to help to find a donor. And do not offer to donate your kidney. 1, 2, and 3 are explicitly included. 4, 5, and 6 are explicitly excluded. Now look at the maximal course of action. A1, hear what John has to say. You'll note it's the same as I1. A2, ask John's blood type. And A3, offer to donate your kidney. Now we'll look at the things that are explicitly excluded from the maximal course of action. Do not say you're sorry that there is nothing you can do. That wouldn't make sense with the maximal course of action. Do not offer to help to find a donor because you're already offering to donate your own kidney. And do not tell him he should ask his family if they can donate. All right? That's A6. So if you need to come back to this spot in the video after the next slide or part of the next slide, because we're going to be referencing back to these I1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, A1, 2, 3, 4, and so on, feel free to go back and forth, because hopefully, with the information I'm going to give you, you should completely understand the way that maximal, minimal, beyond the call, permissibly suboptimal, and everything interact correctly. So, we're going to come back to our significant propositions within the scope of optional propositions, significant propositions. Here we go. Once again, at the bottom, we have actions that are explicitly included in the maximal course of action. At the top, we have actions that are explicitly excluded from the maximal course of action. On the right, we have actions explicitly included in the minimal course of action. And on the left, we have actions explicitly excluded from the minimal course of action. Okay. Remembering all of these things, let's put the pieces of our example in. So, in our bottom right crossover section, we have both A1 and I1. Here what John has to say was included in both our maximal course of action and our minimal course of action. So it's going to go here. In our area just to the right, just in that circle to the right, not in any of the crossover areas, we have I2, offer your condolences. This is something that wasn't explicitly included in or excluded from the maximal course of action. It makes sense that you could offer your condolences when you're going to then offer to donate a kidney, but you don't have to. It's not something that's required of the maximal course of action, but it is something that's required of the minimal course of action. So it's going to fit into this area. Now, looking at the top right crossover area, we have A4 and I3, which are actually the same proposition, which is that say you are sorry, there's nothing you can do. Because there is something you can do if you're taking the maximal course of action, namely donating your kidney. This is explicitly excluded from the maximal course of action, but because it's part of the minimal course of action, it's going to be explicitly included in the minimal course of action. So it's going to fit in that crossover area between in the maximal course of action and excluded from the, in the minimal course of action rather, and excluded from the maximal course of action. Over here on the left, we're going to have I for offer to pay for the operation. This is something that is not explicitly included or excluded from the maximal course of action. You could offer to pay for the operation, but what we're saying the maximal course of action is just offering to donate your kidney. So it could fit into one of those, but it definitely doesn't fit into the minimal course of action. It's explicitly excluded from the minimal course of action. In the top left crossover zone, we have A5 and I5, which once again are the same proposition. Offer to help find a donor. That's something that's explicitly excluded from the maximal course of action because you're offering to donate, so it doesn't make sense for you to offer to help find a donor, but it's also explicitly excluded from the minimal course of action because that's way more than the least that you can do. In this bottom left crossover area, we have A3 or I6. Once again, the same proposition. Offer to donate your kidney. This is clearly part of the maximal course of action. It's explicitly part of the maximal course of action and explicitly not part of the minimal course of action. We've explicitly said you're not going to donate your kidney if you take the minimal course of action, and we've explicitly said you are going to donate your kidney if you take the maximal course of action. So it fits into this crossover area. A2, Ask John's blood type, is something that must be part of the maximal course of action, so you can find out if you can donate your kidney, but it doesn't necessarily need to be part of or excluded from the minimal course of action. So it's kind of indifferent as to whether or not it's part of the minimal course of action, but it's definitely part of the maximal course of action, so it fits down here. A6, on the other hand, is going to fit in the top area, which is tell him he should ask his family if they can donate. It has to be explicitly excluded from the maximal course of action because, once again, you're telling him he should ask his family if they can donate, but also offering to donate your own kidney doesn't really make sense. But it could or could not be part of the minimal course of action. That's something that seems pretty minimal for you to do. It seems part of the least you can do, but it might not necessarily be. So it's not explicitly in or explicitly excluded from the minimal course of action, but it's definitely excluded from the maximal course of action. And finally, our special ninth category we have out here, which is a proposition 7 that we didn't see in the previous slide because it is, by definition, not explicitly included in or excluded from the maximal course of action or the minimal course of action. And that's going to be given the contact info for a great transplant surgeon that you know. It's not explicitly included in the maximal course of action, but it could be part of that because if you're offering to donate your kidney, you could be saying, oh, let's use this transplant surgeon. But it also doesn't need to be excluded from it because maybe you don't have a great transplant surgeon in your Rolodex. And it's not necessarily part of or not part of the minimal course of action either because it seems like something that would be in line with the least you can do, but it doesn't have to be. All right? Hopefully, that gives you a little bit of a sense of all of the different kind of ways that you can parse this distinction, all of the different propositions that could end up in these different 9 areas. And hopefully you'll be able to look at now your ethical dilemmas and say, is what I'm about to do maximally optimal, or is it permissibly suboptimal? Is it beyond the call, or is it minimal? Up next, we are going to be looking at, for our special Halloween edition, some of the paradoxes of Deontic logic. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org and watch a new video every single day for 2 more months on Modal Logic. Stay skeptical, everybody.